a tank too weak to fight other tanks. That was the verdict on the M3 Stuart by the time the war reached its middle years. And yet in the jungles of the Pacific, this same tank became one of the deadliest weapons American infantry ever fought beside. Not because the tank changed, because one piece of ammunition did. The M3 Stuart entered service in 1941. 13 tons, a 37mm main gun, a crew of 4. By the standards of the war it would fight through, it was small from the start. As German armor scaled up through the war, the Stuart's 37mm gun couldn't keep pace. Against a Panther or a Tiger, it simply wasn't a fair fight. And by the time those tanks appeared on European battlefields, the Stuart had already been pulled back to a reconnaissance role there. On paper, it was a tank the war was leaving behind. But 6,000 miles away, in the jungles of the Philippines and the Solomon Islands, none of that mattered. This wasn't tank versus tank warfare. It was warfare against dense terrain, narrow tracks, and an enemy that fought from cover, bunkers, and the tree line. And here, the Stuart's biggest weakness, its lightweight, became its biggest advantage. Where a 40-ton Sherman would bog down or simply not fit, a 13-ton Stuart could still move. December 22nd, 1941. Near Damortis, on the island of Luzon, 5 M3 Stuarts of the 192nd Tank Battalion meet Japanese Type 95 tanks head-on. It's the first American tank-on-tank engagement of the entire war. 9 days later, New Year's Eve at Baliuag, a dozen Japanese tanks destroyed or damaged. American losses that day, 0. A tank supposedly too weak for this fight had just won it outright. It didn't last. Within days, the tide of the Philippines campaign turned. Japanese reinforcements kept landing on Luzon. American and Filipino lines kept bending under pressure. They didn't have the numbers to absorb. And by Christmas, the entire plan changed. It stopped being about holding Luzon and became about saving the army that was still on it. General MacArthur ordered a general withdrawal into the Bataan Peninsula, a fighting retreat across more than 100 miles of roads that the Japanese were already racing to cut before the columns could get through. And somebody had to hold those roads open, mile by mile, long enough for the retreat to actually happen instead of collapsing into a rout. That job went to the Provisional Tank Group, Stuarts included. The San Fernando to Dinalupahan Road was the bottleneck the whole retreat depended on. Every unit pulling back toward Bataan had to funnel through it, in trucks, on foot, dragging what equipment they could still move. And every single hour the tanks held that road open was an hour the infantry columns behind them got to survive. The 194th Tank Battalion took 50% losses doing exactly that, trading tanks and crews for time, one delaying action at a time. The Stuarts of the Provisional Tank Group were, by design, the very last armored unit to cross into Bataan, the rearguard's rearguard, staying on the wrong side of the line until there was almost nobody left behind them to protect. They didn't save the Philippines campaign, nobody could have. The garrison was outnumbered, outsupplied, and had effectively been written off by its own high command before the first Japanese soldier ever landed on Luzon. But the tanks bought time. And on Bataan, time was about to become the only currency that mattered. Life inside that rearguard action was as much a mechanical fight as a tactical one. The Stuart's thin armor, barely enough to stop rifle-caliber fire in places, was never meant to survive close infantry assault, and Japanese troops on Bataan learned fast to hunt tanks with magnetic mines and satchel charges instead of trying to outgun them. Crews fought half-deaf inside a 13-ton steel box in tropical heat, with parts and fuel running lower every week as the siege dragged on and no resupply convoy was coming. Keeping tanks running at all, let alone fighting in them, was its own daily battle, fought with whatever spares could be scavenged from vehicles already destroyed. What followed on Bataan was a siege, not a battle. Nearly 3 months of disease, collapsing supply lines, quarter rations, and an enemy that kept probing the American perimeter from the jungle tree line instead of massing for the kind of open field armor clash the Stuart had been built to fight. And it was there, dug in and fighting a defensive war of ambush and close contact instead of a war of movement, that the Provisional Tank Group ran into a simple, uncomfortable question they hadn't needed to ask back in the Lingayen Gulf landings. What came out of that siege wasn't a new tank. because there was no new tank coming. It was a new answer to an old question. In terrain like this, against an enemy that attacks from cover and from close range, instead of massing armor in the open, what does a light tank's main gun actually need to do? Not punch through enemy armor, because there was barely any enemy armor left on Bataan to punch through in the first place. It needed to clear infantry, fast, before they closed the distance to grenade range. The US Army already had a shell built for exactly that job. It just hadn't been treated as the priority. Ammunition doctrine for the Stuart's 37mm gun had been written with a war against other tanks in mind. Armor-piercing rounds first, high-explosive second, canister filed away as a distant afterthought for a fight nobody expected to actually need it in. Field Manual 23-81, the Army's own technical guidance on the weapon, said otherwise, and said it plainly. Canister was built for one specific purpose: turning a tank's main gun into something closer to a giant shotgun. For the exact moment, the enemy in front of the barrel wasn't armor at all. It was a squad of infantry closing in through cover, or a machine gun crew dug into a bunker with only a narrow firing slit exposed to return fire through. On Bataan, dug in and fighting defensively day after day, that description matched almost every single engagement the tank crews actually fought. Fired from the Stuart's 37mm gun, a single M51 canister round released 122 steel balls in a shotgun-like spread the instant it left the barrel. No fuse delay, no need to judge distance the way an artillery observer would. Against a tank's armor plate, all that spread did nothing at all. The round wasn't designed to and couldn't defeat armor. Against infantry caught out in the open or dug into cover with only a narrow firing slit exposed to the blast, it was close to unsurvivable. One shell, one blast radius, no need to walk a machine gun burst onto a moving target the way an infantry weapon would have to. For a tank that could no longer win a straight fight against Japanese armor, and by this point in the campaign, increasingly wasn't fighting Japanese armor at all, this was the shell that actually mattered in the fight it was in. Field Manual 23-81 didn't just describe what canister did, it told crews when to reach for it, instead of the standard armor-piercing round loaded by default. The guidance was blunt. Against massed infantry in the open or dug into field fortifications at short range, canister was the primary weapon of choice, not a fallback. Against armor or hardened emplacements at distance, it was worthless, and crews were expected to know the difference in the seconds it took to call out a target and load the matching shell. On a peninsula where the enemy rarely offered a clean tank target and constantly offered an infantry one, that single line of doctrine reordered what every loader in the provisional tank group reached for first. On April 7, 1942, 2 days before Bataan finally fell, the provisional tank group fought its last tank engagement of the entire campaign, destroying 2 Japanese tanks in what would stand as the final tank versus tank action of the whole Philippines campaign. It was a small, almost footnote-sized victory, fought in a battle everyone on the peninsula already knew was lost. Bataan would surrender 2 days later. But that last engagement closed the loop on everything the unit had just spent 4 months learning under siege conditions. How to fight while outnumbered. How to fight a defensive war instead of the open field duel the tank had been designed for. And exactly what a 37mm gun could and couldn't do once the terrain and the enemy's tactics had changed the fight underneath it. The lesson didn't die with Bataan, even though the men who learned it there went into Japanese captivity days later. 8 months after that final engagement, on a different island chain entirely, in a different branch of the American Armed Forces, the same family of tank and the same overlooked shell would get a second chance. This time, it wouldn't be fighting a retreat. It would be leading an advance from the very first hours of the campaign. August 1942. The 1st Marine Tank Battalion comes ashore at Guadalcanal and Tulagi in the Solomon Islands, the first Marine tank unit ever committed to combat in the war, equipped with the same family of American light tanks that had just fought through Bataan, M2A4s, alongside newer M3 Stuarts. What they landed into wasn't open ground suited to a tank duel. It was dense rainforest, tangled kunai grass taller than a man, coral ridgelines, and river crossings that would have swallowed a 40-ton Sherman whole, terrain that would have favored a lighter vehicle no matter what heavier tank eventually showed up later in the Pacific War. The Stuart's weight, the very thing that had made it a losing proposition in a straight European tank duel against Panthers and Tigers, was exactly what let it move through ground that a heavier tank simply could not cross. And there, from the first weeks of the campaign, the canister round did exactly what the rearguard action on Bataan had already proven it could do. This time by design instead of improvisation. Group after group of Japanese infantry, flushed out of cover by supporting Marine riflemen, were cut down in the open by 37mm guns, firing shot instead of armor-piercing shells. Bunkers built from coconut logs and packed earth went quiet. Not because a shell punched through their walls, which canister was never meant to do, but because it found the one gap those walls couldn't cover, the firing slit itself. The only place a defender inside had to expose himself to shoot back. The clearest proof came within 2 weeks of the landing, at the mouth of a jungle stream the Marines had nicknamed Alligator Creek. Late on the night of August 20th, 1942, a Japanese force of roughly 900 men tried to force the crossing in a series of massed frontal attacks straight into prepared Marine positions along the sandbar. Marine artillery and machine guns broke the attacks through the night, but by first light, hundreds of Japanese soldiers, dead, wounded, and still fighting, remained pinned against the sand. That's when the light tanks came down off the tree line and onto the sandbar itself, moving down the length of the position and firing canister into the wreckage of the assault at point-blank range. It was brutal, and it was decisive, and war correspondents who witnessed it afterward described the tanks finishing what the infantry and artillery had started in a matter of minutes. It was the same tactic the Provisional Tank Group had improvised out of necessity on Bataan 7 months earlier, now used on purpose, from the opening days of an entirely different campaign. The tactic didn't stay a one-battle trick either. Through the rest of the Guadalcanal campaign and later at Tarawa and Peleliu, Marine and Army light tank crews kept reaching for canister whenever the target in front of them was infantry or a bunker instead of enemy armor, because by then the Doctrine had caught up with what the men on Bataan had already figured out under fire. This was a Pacific War weapon, not a European one, and it needed a Pacific War shell to go with it. The tank itself kept evolving even as the tactic spread. The original M3, riveted hull and gasoline-powered, gave way through the war to the welded hull M3A1, and eventually the diesel M5. Each version chasing small improvements in armor, reliability, and crew survivability without ever touching the one thing that mattered most in this theater: the same 37mm gun and the same shell locker underneath the turret ring that could just as easily hold canister as armor piercing. That continuity is exactly why the lesson from Bataan could travel forward so cleanly, unit to unit and island to island. The gun didn't change, only the Doctrine did. The Stuart never got a bigger gun. It never needed one. Historian Stephen Zaloga, who has spent decades studying exactly this question in his research on the M3 and M5 Stuart, put it simply: these were not good tanks by European standards, undergunned and thin-skinned against anything the German army fielded by mid-war. But they were exactly the tanks the Pacific needed. At Guadalcanal, at Tarawa, at Peleliu, and everywhere else the fight came down to infantry, terrain, and short range instead of tank versus tank in open country. The tank that was supposedly too weak to fight didn't win by getting stronger. It won because someone, first out of desperation on Bataan and later on purpose at Guadalcanal, finally asked what this specific fight actually required and loaded the right shell for it instead of the one the manual had assumed they'd need. That one shift in thinking, from armor-piercing assumptions to canister-first doctrine, turned a tank the war had already written off in Europe into one of the most effective infantry support weapons the Pacific theater produced, an arc that runs from a doomed rearguard action on a peninsula nobody could save to an opposed beach landing in the Solomons, and on through the rest of the island-hopping campaign that followed. None of this shows up in the way the Stuart usually gets remembered. Most World War II tank content, understandably, gravitates toward the European theater. Shermans against Panthers and Tigers, the kind of tank versus tank duels the Stuart was never built to win, and by 1943 had already been pulled out of. Judged purely by that European yardstick, the M3 Stuart reads as a footnote, a stopgap design the war outgrew within its first 2 years. But that yardstick was always measuring the wrong fight. In the Pacific, against an enemy that rarely massed armor in the open, and almost always fought from cover, at close range, in terrain that punished anything heavy, the questions that mattered were different questions entirely, and the Stuart, with the right shell loaded, kept answering them correctly for the rest of the war. It's one overlooked trick, from one overlooked theater of the war, that changed what a 13-ton tank with a gun everyone considered obsolete could actually do when it was pointed at the right target. There are more stories like this one, hiding in the parts of the war that don't usually make it onto the poster, buried under the tanks and battles everyone already knows by heart. Subscribe if you want the next one.